Perhaps you've heard of the hunchbacked king, the villain of Shakespeare's stage, the murderer of innocent princes, the monster who seized England's throne through treachery and blood. Richard III was that shadow, the youngest son who became a king, the loyal brother who became a usurper, the warrior who died with his crown still on his head. He ruled for only 2 years, yet his name echoes through 5 centuries of controversy. He dissolved the innocence of childhood when he allegedly murdered his nephews, orchestrated the fall of a rival dynasty, and became the last medieval king of England. Yet he also championed justice for the poor, defended the North with honor, and fought to his last breath on Bosworth Field. History cannot decide if he was a devoted servant or a calculating tyrant, a protector or a predator, a hero or a villain. Perhaps he was all of these, and none of them. Tonight, we journey back 5 centuries, to a world where spines curved under the weight of armor and ambition, where one brother's death meant another's coronation, and where loyalty was repaid with a crown or a grave. So close your eyes, breathe slowly, and step into the shadows of the Wars of the Roses as we enter the sleep story, Richard III, the King in the Shadows. October 2nd, 1452. At Fotheringhay Castle in Northamptonshire, a boy was born into a family at war with itself. His name was Richard, the 12th child and 4th son of Richard, Duke of York, and Cecily Neville. He entered a world already torn apart by the Wars of the Roses, a brutal civil conflict between 2 branches of the royal family, the houses of Lancaster and York. The Red Rose of Lancaster faced the White Rose of York across blood-soaked battlefields, and young Richard would grow up knowing that survival meant choosing the right side. Richard's father believed he had a stronger claim to England's throne than King Henry VI, a man plagued by mental breakdowns. The Duke of York had served as Lord Protector, but ambition drove him further. He wanted the crown for himself. When Richard was only 8 years old, everything changed. On December 30th, 1460, at the Battle of Wakefield, his father was killed in combat. The Lancastrians cut off his head and placed it on a spike above York's gates, adorned with a paper crown. Richard's 17-year-old brother Edmund also died that day. Richard's mother Cecily became known as the Rose of Raby, but in that winter she was simply a widow protecting her surviving children. Richard and his brother George were smuggled across the English Channel to Burgundy, where they would live in exile. Imagine being 8 years old, torn from your home, watching your mother's face as she sends you away, not knowing if you will ever see England again. Richard spent those formative years learning war and statecraft, while his eldest brother Edward fought to avenge their father's death. As historian Dr. John Ashdown Hill noted, Richard's early life was defined by loss and exile, experiences that would shape the man he became. But Edward was a warrior of exceptional skill. On March 4, 1461, just 3 months after their father's death, Edward defeated the Lancastrians at the Battle of Towton, the bloodiest battle ever fought on English soil. 28,000 men died in a single day. The snow that morning turned red by afternoon, and by evening, Edward had won himself a kingdom. Edward seized the throne and became King Edward IV at 19. Richard and George could finally return home. Richard was now Duke of Gloucester, brother to the king. He was 9 years old, and his real education was about to begin. Edward placed Richard in the household of Richard Neville, the Earl of Warwick, known as the Kingmaker. At Middleham Castle in Yorkshire, Richard learned to fight, to ride, to lead men in combat. Medieval historian Dominic Sewell explained, "Knights of that era received one-to-one training from childhood. It was not just about physical skill, but about honor, duty, and the weight of command." Richard proved to be a dedicated student. Unlike his brother George, who was charming but unreliable, Richard earned a reputation for loyalty and competence. He was smaller than most knights, his frame slender, but he compensated with speed and tactical intelligence. Yet between the ages of 10 and 13, his body began to change. His spine started to curve, slowly at first, then dramatically. Modern medical analysis revealed that Richard developed severe scoliosis during adolescence, with a spinal curve between 60 and 80 degrees. Dr. Piers Mitchell, a specialist in medieval health, explained, "This condition would have started during his pubertal growth spurt. His right shoulder would have sat noticeably higher than his left, and his torso would have twisted as the spine curved. The condition caused Richard considerable pain. His rib cage compressed on one side, making it harder to breathe during exertion. Yet he never let it stop him. He continued training, adapted his fighting style, and became known as a capable military commander. The medieval saddle, with its high rigid back, actually helped support his spine while riding. But the scoliosis would haunt Richard after his death. His enemies transformed his physical condition into a symbol of moral corruption, claiming his twisted spine reflected a twisted soul. Shakespeare immortalized this slander, creating the hunchbacked villain that still dominates popular imagination. Yet, as archaeologist Richard Buckley observed, the skeleton showed no evidence of a withered arm or grotesque deformity. What we found was a warrior who fought until the very end. By 1469, when Richard was 17, the Wars of the Roses reignited. The Earl of Warwick turned against King Edward and allied with the Lancastrians. Richard faced an agonizing choice: betray his mentor or betray his brother. He chose Edward, and that choice would define the rest of his life. When Edward reclaimed the throne in 1471, he rewarded Richard with lands in the north of England and command of the Scottish borders. For the next 12 years, Richard served as his brother's most dependable ally, the shadow behind the throne. He married Anne Neville, daughter of the Earl of Warwick, and they had a son named Edward. Richard governed the North with a reputation for fairness and justice. Records show he established a legal aid system for the poor and worked to end corruption in local courts. The people of York would later mourn his death deeply, an unusual reaction if he had truly been a monster. But tensions were building at court. King Edward had married Elizabeth Woodville in secret, angering many nobles. The Woodville family gained power and influence, and Richard, distant in the north, watched with growing unease. He saw how his brother George had been executed in 1478, allegedly for treason. Richard understood the precarious nature of power. He had seen his father's head on a spike, his brother Edmund killed at 17, his mentor Warwick die on the battlefield. He knew that today's trusted advisor could be tomorrow's condemned traitor. And then, on April 9, 1483, everything changed. King Edward IV died suddenly at age 40. Edward's heir was his 12-year-old son, Edward V, a boy who would need a protector. That protector would be Richard, Duke of Gloucester, The boy who had fled into exile at 8 was now 30, an experienced military commander and administrator. His nephew needed him, England needed him, and Richard answered the call. The young king was being escorted to London by the Woodvilles, who had begun consolidating power. Richard intercepted them at Stony Stratford on April 29th. He arrested the king's escort on charges of plotting against him. He took custody of young Edward, and in that moment the die was cast. Richard brought his nephew to London, where the boy was housed in the Tower of London, not yet a prison, but a royal residence. Richard was named Lord Protector, but tensions escalated quickly. Then came the revelation that would change everything. On June 22, 1483, a clergyman named Ralph Shaw preached a sermon claiming that Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville had been invalid, because Edward had been contracted to marry another woman. If true, Edward's children were illegitimate and could not inherit the throne. Parliament accepted the claim. Edward V and his younger brother Richard were declared illegitimate. On June 26, 1483, Richard was offered the crown. He accepted. On July 6, 1483, he was crowned King Richard III. But what of the princes? Young Edward and his brother remained in the Tower. At first, they were seen playing in the gardens. But as weeks passed, they were seen less and less. By autumn, they had disappeared entirely. No official announcement was made. No bodies were discovered. They simply vanished. The mystery of the princes in the Tower was born, and it would haunt Richard's reputation forever. Did Richard order their deaths? The evidence is circumstantial but damning. He had the motive. They were threats to his throne. He had the means. They were in his custody. He had the opportunity. He was king. Yet no contemporary source directly accuses him of the murders. The first detailed accusation came from Sir Thomas More, writing 30 years later under the Tudor regime. More claimed that Richard ordered Sir James Tyrrell to suffocate the boys in their beds, but More was not an eyewitness. What we know for certain, the princes disappeared. Richard benefited from their disappearance, and he never produced them to prove they were alive. As historian Helen Castor observed, Richard was a man whose life was shaped and scarred by war. Perhaps, in his mind, the death of 2 children was a small price for the stability of the realm. Richard's reign lasted only 2 years. He established the Court of Requests to provide legal aid to the poor. He passed laws protecting buyers from fraud and limiting excessive bail. He promoted trade and encouraged printing presses. He worked to reform the justice system. In the north, where he had governed for years, he was genuinely loved. But in the south, suspicion and resentment festered. Then tragedy struck. In April 1484, his only son Edward died at Middleham Castle, probably of tuberculosis. The boy was 10 years old. Richard was devastated. The chroniclers recorded that he was almost out of his mind with grief. His heir was gone, his dynasty's future uncertain. Less than a year later, in March 1485, Queen Anne herself died. Richard was left alone, his family destroyed, his throne threatened. Meanwhile, across the English Channel, a new threat was gathering. Henry Tudor, a Lancastrian claimant with a tenuous connection to the royal bloodline, was preparing an invasion with French support. Henry's claim was weak. He was descended from John of Gaunt through an illegitimate line, but he had a promise. He had sworn to marry Elizabeth of York, thus uniting the houses of Lancaster and York and ending the Wars of the Roses forever. On August 7, 1485, Henry landed in Wales with an army of French mercenaries and English exiles. Richard received word and immediately began gathering his forces. The two armies would meet at Bosworth Field in Leicestershire on August 22, 1485. Richard commanded the larger force, perhaps 8,000 men to Henry's 5,000. But the outcome would depend on the loyalty of powerful nobles whose allegiances were uncertain. The night before the battle, Richard stayed at the Blue Boar Inn in Leicester. According to legend, he slept poorly, troubled by nightmares. In the morning, as he rode out across Bow Bridge, his spur struck the parapet. An old woman called out a prophecy. "Where your spurs strikes on the way out, your head will strike on the way back." Richard ignored her, but her words would prove eerily accurate. The Battle of Bosworth began on the morning of August 22nd. Richard positioned his forces on Ambion Hill, giving him the advantage of higher ground. For hours the armies clashed in brutal hand-to-hand combat. Richard fought from the front, his crown worn over his helmet so his men could see him. Despite his physical condition, he was a fierce warrior. Modern experiments have proven that a person with scoliosis could fight effectively in armor. Then Richard spotted Henry Tudor in the distance, surrounded only by a small bodyguard. In a moment of reckless courage, Richard made his decision. He would end this war with a single charge. He would kill Henry Tudor himself. Richard gathered his household knights and charged down the hill. He killed Henry's standard-bearer with his own hand. He came within feet of Henry himself. Victory was within his grasp. But at that crucial moment, Lord Stanley made his choice. Stanley's forces attacked Richard from the flank. Richard's charge was surrounded. His horse became mired in marshy ground. He refused offers of escape, shouting, "Treason! Treason! Treason!" as he fought on. His helmet was torn from his head, and then the killing blows came. The wounds on Richard's skeleton tell the story of his final moments. 2 devastating blows to the back of his skull, one from a sword that sliced through bone and into his brain, another that removed a section of skull. 9 wounds to the head in total, most inflicted after he had fallen. A dagger thrust through the base of his skull, a blade cut to the jaw, and a wound to his pelvis, a humiliation strike delivered after death. As Polydore Virgil, Henry Tudor's historian, recorded, Richard was killed fighting manfully in the thickest press of his enemies. Even his enemies acknowledged his courage. They stripped his body, tied a rope around his neck, and brought him back to Leicester slung over a horse. As the body crossed Bow Bridge, Richard's head struck the same parapet where his spur had caught. The old woman's prophecy had come true. Richard was buried quickly at Greyfriars Church in Leicester. For a king, it was a shameful burial. No coffin, no shroud, just a hastily dug grave. Henry Tudor claimed the throne as Henry VII. He married Elizabeth of York, uniting the warring houses. He founded the Tudor dynasty, and he ensured that Richard's reputation would be destroyed as thoroughly as his body had been. The Tudor historians painted Richard as a monster, the hunchbacked villain who murdered his nephews and seized the throne. Shakespeare immortalized this version in his play. For 5 centuries, this was the Richard everyone knew, the Richard everyone believed in. But in 2012, everything changed. Philippa Langley, a member of the Richard III Society, led an archaeological team to a parking lot in Leicester. Against all odds, in the very first trench, they found human leg bones. Days later, they had uncovered a complete skeleton with severe scoliosis and 10 wounds to the skull. DNA testing confirmed what seemed impossible. They had found Richard III. His bones revealed truths that history had obscured. Yes, he had scoliosis, but no withered arm, no grotesque deformity. Yes, he died violently, but fighting to the end. Analysis of his teeth and bones showed he had eaten a rich diet, consumed wine in quantity, and suffered from roundworm parasites. Facial reconstruction, based on his skull, produced a face that looked remarkably like the early portraits. A thin, thoughtful face, not the sneering villain of Shakespeare's imagination. On March 26, 2015, Richard III was finally given the burial he had been denied 530 years earlier. His remains were interred in Leicester Cathedral with full honors, attended by thousands. Benedict Cumberbatch, a distant relation, read a specially commissioned poem. The Archbishop of Canterbury presided. A king was finally laid to rest with dignity. But the mystery remains. Was Richard III a villain who murdered his nephews? Or was he a capable king who ruled justly before dying bravely on the battlefield? Was he a victim of Tudor propaganda? The answer, perhaps, is that he was a man of his time, a time when political murder was common, when loyalty was fleeting, when survival meant making ruthless decisions. Perhaps Richard was all things and none. A loyal brother who seized his nephew's throne, a just ruler who may have ordered children killed, a warrior king who died fighting. History cannot decide, and perhaps that is fitting. Richard III remains what he has always been, the king in the shadows. The last Plantagenet king died in battle, his crown falling into a thorn bush where Henry Tudor retrieved it. The medieval age died with Richard on Bosworth Field. The Tudor age began in that same moment. Richard's death closed one chapter of English history and opened another. "5 centuries later, his bones emerged from beneath a parking lot marked with the letter R, giving him one final chance to tell his story, not through the words of his enemies, but through the evidence of his own body. The twisted spine that made him a monster in legend proved only that he had overcome adversity. The wounds to his skull proved he had fought bravely. The simple grave proved he had been denied the honor due to a king. Tonight, as you close your eyes and drift towards sleep, perhaps you can imagine Richard on that August morning, wearing his crown over his helmet, charging down Ambion Hill toward his destiny. Perhaps you can see him fighting in the marshland, refusing to flee, dying as he had lived, in the thick of battle, loyal to the very end. And perhaps, just perhaps, you can let history rest, neither condemning nor celebrating, but simply remembering the king who lived in the shadows and died in the light. Leave your thoughts in the comments below, and if this story moved you, remember to like, subscribe, and join us again as we unveil the hidden truths of history.